Hey everyone, it's Allie, and it's time to talk about our mana stacking Kinetic Blast Whisper. We have quite a few really nice changes for the build, and we have managed to get ourselves substantially more single target damage than we had before. Progression, honestly, with this build has felt amazing, and I basically didn't really struggle at any points, all the way from T1 maps all the way to T16. And, well, the build pretty much turned out exactly the way we expected it, and it's been a really comfy and fun time the whole way through. What we have ended up figuring out is that we should now be swapping over to Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation for single target damage, which is an absurd single target damage increase in comparison to the normal Kinetic Blast. While at low budget levels, it's basically going to be the same. Due to the scaling nature of Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation, it very quickly is going to beat Kinetic Blast in terms of raw damage, very quickly making it your best friend. Let's go over exactly what that entails, as well as talk over a few things that some people seem to have been missing, and that some people seem to have been struggling with the start of this build. So if we first want to start talking about the issues that people have been having early on, the biggest one that I've been seeing is that people haven't been getting enough dexterity and mana for a build. Well, I didn't necessarily fully spell this out, and a part of this is partially my fault. Some people have been trying to swap over to builds with way too little buff stats, basically giving them no way to realistically scale the build. All of our damage is going to come from We Know All and Arcane Cloak to begin with. Both of these nodes are going to scale off your total mana, and if you start mapping with something like 1 to 1,500 mana, you're unfortunately going to have a pretty bad time. This is why I've been telling people to stick to Rain of Arrows while they do their heist before swapping over, as with Rain of Arrows, you can very easily get through everything just fine. Now, we did make quite a few changes to our Ascendancy node order, as we just found that quite a few things feel a little bit better if we do in a little bit of a different order. And what we've realized is that wait a little just doesn't really feel that good while leveling. It actually feels pretty lackluster. And what we're instead going to do is simply just rush for We Know All with our 2 first Ascendancy points, which should give you a little bit of extra damage in heist while playing with Rain of Arrows. And then afterwards, we are then going to be taking Your Mind is Destroyed, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, as we need it for Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation. And well, if you do that, you can then go and buy yourself a Deodres early on into your heisting experience, which will then work with Rain of Arrows, giving you a pretty decent damage boost to begin with. Last thing I want to mention for heist is you could potentially drop your Anger and Runner Graze if you want to, and that'll make you substantially tankier while doing your heist if you're still on that portion of the build, and that should hopefully make everything a little bit comfier to do as well. Now, in terms of mapping and swapping over, what I recommend for everyone to try and reach is about 2,000 mana and about 500 or so dexterity. Both those numbers should be fairly easy to reach, and they shouldn't be too overbearing given we do need to hit our intelligence breakpoints, and we do need to get ourselves res cap. Now, you don't need that much life on your gear. I personally started mapping with about 2,500 life, and everything honestly felt pretty good. So if needed, just drop 1 or 2 life rolls on some of your gear with 2.3, 2.4k life. It should also feel pretty comfortable. And then with that, it should be a lot easier for you to find dex and mana on every single piece of gear that you can. It's really important that you look for at least one of those 2 stats everywhere. And given how all we really need is a little bit of int and resistances, it should be fairly easy for you to hit 500 dex and 2k mana. From there, you're going to want to keep scaling it, and you're going to want to look for better dex and mana pieces everywhere. And what I need to mention here is that the crafting bench is the best friend, and if you can eventually find an item with like an open suffix, you should try to craft dex on it, or if you have an open prefix, you should try to craft mana if you don't need anything else in that item. For rings, especially before Mind the Council, given Mind the Council is a little bit expensive, what I'd recommend for you to do is to craft added lane damage on your rings, as that is about a 5% DPS increase per ring, and hopefully that should get you through the early game a little bit easier. Now, we need to specifically talk about Mind the Council here a little bit too as well. The prices of it have kind of just skyrocketed. Now, I did expect it to be a little bit expensive, but I only expected it to be worth maybe 50 chaos at most, which would have very easily fitted in to the amount of money that we would have made while heisting. Because unfortunately now, about 2 divines or so, that's kind of out of reach, especially with the money that you make from heisting, meaning we need to use an alternative. What I'd recommend for you to do is to either use a Fractal Thoughts as a lower tier helmet, although I'm not a fan of it, given you need to get a lot of strength to be able to properly benefit from everything Fractal Thoughts has to offer you. So my recommend instead is to just grab yourself a rare helmet with a really big mana and a really big dex roll on it as a intermediary until you get yourself a Mind the Council later on. You don't really need to find any other stats on here, but obviously if you get yourself some int, some life, some resistances, that'd be great. But given Mind the Council was going to have none of those stats to begin with, just getting yourself a budget Mind the Council that just basically gives you a very large amount of mana is also a pretty good alternative. Now, with that all out of the way, let's discuss the big changes to our build. We are now going to be swapping from Kinetic Blast for single target damage to Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation. You're still going to be using your 4-link Kinetic Blast for mapping. None of that is changing, but your 6-link is specifically now going to become Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation. This skill is absolutely silly, given that it is the only skill in the game that can shotgun the same target. Normally, to be able to get a skill that shoots multiple projectiles in a fan to shotgun, you have to use Barrage, which has its own downsides to it. But with Kinetic Bolts, it basically has a built-in barrage, allowing us to abuse Sniper's Mark to do some very silly damage. What we could do with Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation is we can stand directly under a boss, just like we would for Kinetic Blast, so your gameplay doesn't change at all. And with a Sniper's Mark, each projectile from Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation would then generate 2 additional splits, which would then return and hit the boss again. These returns are going to do 40% less damage, meaning in total, given that each singular projectile of Kinetic Bolts will give you 2 splits, you're gaining effectively 80% more damage per projectile that you do. The beautiful thing about this is we can then scale this with Mark Effect even further. If you got 50% Mark Effect, our Sniper's Mark would go from 2 splits to 3 splits, meaning that we effectively then gain 120% more damage from returning projectiles. At an early stage, this allows us to do slightly more damage than Kinetic Blast does, but once we do hit that 50% Mark Effect breakpoint, which we'll discuss more in the mid-game update for the build, we will then very quickly outpace whatever Kinetic Blast was able to do before, and well, we are going to get some pretty silly damage numbers very quickly in the late game. Realistically, the only thing that you have to change here is grab yourself a new 6-link. In this case, we want Fragmentation, Wisp, Returning Projectiles, and GMP as your core 4 supports, and then you're going to add in any 2 of the following 4 gems. You'll either want to use a lightning pen, an elemental damage attacks, a faster attacks, or an added lightning damage. That means you can look for either 2 blue, 1 green, 1 red, or 1 blue, 1 red for your final 2 sockets. This gives you quite a lot of flexibility and exactly how to put the build together, so it shouldn't be too difficult to find a valid 6-link. The other major change here is specifically going to be what a passive tree is going to look like. Because Point Blank is actually a DPS loss due to the Kinetic Bolt projectiles traveling so far that Point Blank actually gives you about a 20% damage loss, we can completely drop this whole section of our tree and we can now instead path to the top. This saves us a few passive points, meaning it should be easier for you to get to Minor Matter sooner. And the only other thing that we really have to change here is that we are going to be dropping Split Shot in favor of Piercing Shots. Because we need to drop Have You Forgotten to be able to get Your Mind is Destroyed, as otherwise your Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation will be no damage. We do need some sort of projectile modifier to make our Kinetic Blast feel good for clear, and well, just picking up Pierce is honestly going to feel literally just as good as having an Awakened Fork. The trees in the path of building have all been updated with exactly where you want your trees to look like now, and all of them have been updated to how you'd go about progressing this build for a Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation. Outside of that, the other changes that we made to the build are just a few skill changes that we learned feel a lot better than before. First off, I personally just kind of got rid of Blood Rage. While it's nice, it's just kind of annoying having to deal with the degen, so it's up to you if you want to keep it or not. You don't have to get rid of it. But if you like to drop one button from the build, I've gone all the way to T16 maps without it, so you don't really need it if you don't want to. Another thing you might be able to do is you can help pick up Expert Hunter if you want to at an earlier level, and this will then allow you to run a Mark on Hit permanently. The problem with us running Mark on Hit with Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation is that any reduced mark effects, which Mark on Hit has, would then reduce your 2 splits below 2, meaning you only get 1 split at a time, effectively making you lose some around 25% of your DPS. Well, with Expert Hunter, you'd get enough mark effect to be able to run a Mark on Hit, and then that allows you to have Sniper's Mark and Mark on Hit active for your whole mapping experience. The mid-game of the build is probably going to be centered around this, as it just gives you a lot of extra comfort and a lot of extra clear. But in the early stages, if you don't have 3 passive points for it, you might not be able to do it yourself. Finally, the last thing we're going to do is we're going to put an Arcane Cloak in our Berserk on automation. I completely forgot that you could put Arcane Cloak here, and there's basically no reason to not automate your Arcane Cloak, as you pretty much want to use it on cooldown anyways. And while sure, automation makes it a little bit unoptimal, given it has less cooldown recovery on it, the fact that we remove another button from the build honestly is kind of worth it on its own. You also put your Berserk in here if you want to. Although personally, I actually kind of found that Berserk feels kind of bad, and it might overall just feel better if you completely drop your Berserk and just let your Rage be full the whole time with Wait a Little. This is something I want to do a little bit more testing with, and I'll get back to you on this in the mid-game updates on if we end up keeping Berserk or not. But if you do want to drop it, you would simply just put an Enhance in here in your Arcane Cloak to make it give you substantially more damage, or just an increased duration in the early game to make the damage buff from it last a little bit longer. With all that, that's pretty much everything we have to talk about in this video. The TLDR here is we're just swapping over to Kinetic Bolt of Fragmentation, and it's giving us a lot more damage. And we found just a few tree optimizations that you can make to make everything a little bit stronger. In a few days, I should hopefully be able to get you a mid-game guide on how we can progress this build from here into a higher budget version of the build. But until then, realistically, your only goals as you're progressing to T16 maps and beyond is to just get more mana, more dex on all of your gear, and just keep scaling those 2 stats as far as you can. Our goal in the late game is going to be to get about 10,000 mana or so, but to be able to get there, we are going to have to incorporate quite a lot of few unique jewels, which we should hopefully be able to talk about here in a few days at most. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment in the comments below. I'd be more than happy to help you as soon as I can. I also stream on Twitch every single day, so feel free to come by Twitch and ask me any questions there, or if you simply want to come and hang out with other kitties, I'd be more than happy to see you there as well. With all that said, I hope you kitties are having a fun league start. I've been having an absolute blast with this build so far, and I can't wait to see how it scales into some late game farming strategies. With all I said, kitties, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see you all in the next video.